Hello and welcome to our first chapter of A&P. I'm going to begin talking about just some general ideas to get us into the A&P realm, mostly to do with anatomy as we run through some things, which we'll touch on a little physiology as we go as well. And so anatomy and physiology itself is essentially, for anatomy, it's the where is it and what is it. And for the physiology side of things, it's the how does it work. And so when we think of anatomy, we're thinking about being able to name the structures that we're looking for, being able to find them, seeing them in relationship to other areas of the body versus physiology, it's how do those structures actually function? How do they actually work within the body itself? And so with gross anatomy, and with both anatomy and physiology, we can really divide things up between the two as regional characteristics, as systemic characteristics. We can look at things as far as the anatomy goes in terms of just what can we see on the surface of the body. And so regionally, we can look at an arm, we can look at a leg, we can look at the abdomen, the thorax, inside the cranial vault, etc. And so we can look at those different areas themselves and see what's going on in that particular spot. We can look at an entire system. Sometimes the entire system is relatively well packaged together. We don't have to go very far in order to find those structures that are there. Other times we need to go kind of all over the body to find them. We can also look at things from a very small standpoint, and so we can look at essentially kind of the functional side of the body at the cytological aspect in terms of individual cells, what those cells themselves look at. One of the first things that we'll start to look at is histology, and so we'll look at individual tissues as well as the cells that are found within them. Anatomy changes based upon our timing in life, and so we have different structures that we can find at different times looking in different ways, and so we can look at a developmental aspect as well. How do those structures change throughout the course of life, with the biggest changes kind of happening from embryo to fetus. And so that's where we see a lot of the major changes that go on within the body itself. And so embryology in and of itself has a very specific kind of set of looking at the structures that we have. Once we kind of know the normal, and so essentially what we're going to be looking at is normal anatomy. Where do we find things? What do we call those things? And as soon as we know that, then we can start to look at other kind of specialized branches of anatomy as well. And so what happens when we have pathology? What happens in terms of disease to change the organs themselves? If we were in looking at cadavers, we may be able to see some structural changes in terms of the anatomy of different organs because of the disease processes that were going on in those individuals. Radiology tells us a lot about anatomy, and so if you've ever had an x-ray, you know that from that x-ray we can tell things as far as what's going on in the body, what kind of changes may be there, is there anything broken, is there anything out of place, things like that. We can look at the molecular side of things, and so we can look at molecular biology from the aspect of how do we potentially have a medication be able to affect a cell. And so what are those anatomical structures at the subcellular level that we need to be able to initiate in order to make that drug work. For physiology, it's how do all of those organs work? How do the structures that we just named function within the body itself? And so with this, we typically look at it from a systemic outlook. And so we're going to look at the different organ systems themselves. And within each organ system, we basically have a specialization as well. And so we have renal physiology, we have neurophysiology, we have gastroenterology in terms of the digestive system, we have cardiovascular physiology, all kinds of, essentially each of the 11 systems that we have a physiology for it. And so what's going on at that level of the cell to allow for that particular organ and that organ system to function. So in order to truly understand physiology, and for us this won't come about a whole lot initially early on, we need to bring about a couple of other aspects to the table in a sense. And so we have to have a little bit of a knowledge about electricity, and so electrical currents and charges of potential cells and things like that. When we get into the A&P2, you'll start to look at things like blood pressure and pressure variance, and so things like the cardiovascular system as well as the respiratory system relies upon good knowledge of pressures and partial pressures and things like that. When we get into muscles and nerves, we'll talk about things like the electrical currents once again. And so we'll start to look at things as far as the nerves being able to generate an electrical potential. We'll look at things as far as the muscles being able to provide for an electrical potential so that both of them have the ability to fire off what we call action potentials. And so we have the ability to have this electrical discharge within the cells, and that's how they normally function. Within physiology as well, and also within the anatomy of things, we have essentially what we call complementarity. And so, especially when it comes to developmental anatomy and things like that, we have this idea that things are complementary to one another. And so, in a nutshell, this is kind of form follows function and function follows form. And so, depending upon what we have a particular organ or part of the body needed to be able to do, is going to dictate the form that it takes. And as a converse of that, whatever form that it is in, that's the type of function that it's going to be able to do as well. And this becomes more evident when we start to look at things like bones and muscles and their movement and things like that. And so we can start to see how that changes based upon the needs of that particular organ system. One of the things that we have to kind of understand as well when it comes to the human body is that we have different levels of organization, and this is really true for all organisms, in that we start things out at the chemical, and so we begin things to kind of look at them based upon the structures that we have within them, and so we start at the chemical level here, and we have our individual atoms. Those atoms come together to give us a molecule. That molecule then, in terms of proteins and carbohydrates and lipids, becomes our individual cell. And in this case, it's a smooth muscle cell. All those individual cells come together to give us a tissue, like smooth muscle tissue. Combine two or more types of tissue together, and we end up with an organ. And so we have the organ level here of the stomach. And so we've got epithelial tissue. We're going to have the smooth muscle that we just looked at inside there. Not shown, we're going to have things like connective tissue and nervous tissue as well. Combine an organ together with all the other organs needed within that particular system, and we have the entire system level. And so for the digestive tract, we have the majority of all of our organs shown there. And then put all the different organ systems together, and we have the entire organism itself. So we have the entire body there functioning within the system that we reside. So all of the different systems have their own specific specialization, and that specialization that they have there is geared towards whatever job it is that we need to do and whatever job it is that they're going to do for the rest of the body itself. And so each one has its own kind of function there. For each one of the systems that we have here on the next several slides, you have pictures similar to these in your textbook. And for each of them, you just basically right now, you need to know the system itself and then kind of its generalized function. And so integumentary system is, in terms of its general function, would be a barrier. And so it's the outside protection that we have for the body. And in addition, it does things like synthesizes vitamin D. And so it allows for us to produce one of the necessary nutrients that we need for the body. And then it also does things like helps to control body temperature. Deep to the integumentary system, we have the muscular system as well as the skeletal system. And so for each one of those, we have the structures within them. The skeletal system's primary job is protection and support of other organs, in addition to providing for something essentially for the muscles to pull on. And so it's going to give the muscles a mechanical advantage that they need in order to work in a more efficient manner. The skeletal muscle system, as we have here in the picture, this allows for us to move, and so it allows us to get through the environment itself. And as it does so, as we've all experienced when we use our muscles, is it also produces heat. And so it's going to generate heat as a byproduct of all of those muscle contractions. Next up, we have the nervous system. And so for the body, we really have two systems for communication. We have the nervous system and we have the endocrine system. The nervous system is very quick but short-lived. And so it sends signals very quickly, but they don't last for very long. Versus the endocrine system sends its signals relatively slow, but once it gets there, it's generally going to last for a bit longer. And so whereas the nervous system, it's almost in a sense instantly on and then off, the endocrine system's going to stay on for potentially minutes, hours, weeks, and so on. The cardiovascular system is in a sense kind of the reason why the endocrine system takes so long to get there, is because the endocrine system utilizes the cardiovascular system for transport. And so the cardiovascular system's job is transportation. Move things like the nutrients to the tissues, pick up waste on the way back. It's kind of like a highway system for products that are being either produced in the body or received by the body. And so we're going to pick up nutrients from places like the digestive tract, pick up oxygen from the lungs, take those to the tissues, dump those off, pick up waste products from all of our cells, and get them away from the cells themselves. So it's a kind of a two-way system, delivery and picking up. It's kind of like having a delivery truck that not only delivers your packages, but it also then picks up your garbage. But the cardiovascular system is not 100% efficient. And so because of that, it needs the lymphatic system as well. And so the lymphatic system is going to kind of pick up all of the extra fluid that ends up lying in between all of our cells. And so it's getting up all of the extracellular fluid that's there. If, as it picks it up, it finds something that is foreign that shouldn't be there, it's going to initiate an immune response. And so it's going to start the immune response to allow for us to destroy whatever might happen to be there within that lymph tissue that was picked up. The respiratory system is all about gas exchange. And so this is oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. And so we're exchanging gases between the inside of the body and the outside of the body. The digestive system is all about digestion and then absorption of nutrients. And so break down the nutrients as we bring them into the system, get them ready to be in the form of something that we can actually absorb, so that we can then send it off to the cardiovascular system to transport it throughout. Our last two systems are the urinary system and the reproductive system. The urinary system is all about getting rid of that waste that the cardiovascular system picked up from the cells, and it's going to take that waste and eliminate it from the body. Primarily, this waste is what we call nitrogenous waste. And so its job is to get rid of all of the nitrogenous waste that we may have in the body. The reproductive system is actually kind of a twofold system in that it's both endocrine as well as reproduction. And so it's going to produce hormones that are going to be utilized for the reproductive systems themselves. And then it also produces the gametes and the hormones that are needed in order to produce the gametes for reproduction. Any given organ system can't live on its own. And so each individual organ system is going to have an interrelationship with one another. As we just kind of saw as we went through the systems, no system kind of has everything in and of itself. And so even in this basic kind of a process here of the body systems that we have the respiratory system, we have the cardiovascular system, so we have our circulatory system here. This is going to move all of the nutrients that we have around. We're going to get oxygen into the blood. We're going to get nutrients coming in and broken down and getting absorbed, moving that into the blood. And then once we deliver all of that to the tissues, we're going to drop off the nutrients, pick up the wastes, send that over to our excretory system or the urinary system, and get rid of all of that nitrogenous waste. And so even for just kind of delivering things, we're going to go through all the other systems themselves. And kind of not shown here, we have things like the nervous system ruling over all of it as far as the systems themselves go. In order for all of those systems to function normally, we need to have a few things kind of come into the realm of the person themselves. And so one of the big things is to maintain boundaries. This happens both at the whole organism level as well as at the cellular level. And so at the whole organism level, we have our skin, and more particularly, we have epithelial tissues because we don't have skin everywhere. The respiratory system and the digestive system both have barriers there as well. And then even at the cellular level, we have a barrier as well called the plasma membrane. This is the outside of the individual cells. This is what keeps essentially what's outside the cells out and what's inside the cells in, unless we want to allow for things to move back and forth. And that movement comes in the form of the entire body. So we have locomotion. We can move the entire body around. We're going to have to move things inside the body. And so we're going to have things like peristalsis occurring. This happens for digestive tract, urinary tract, in terms of the movement of substances through organs. We have contractility of things like the cardiovascular system, and so on. As we go about our day, we need to be able to respond to things that are in our environment. And so some of those things are literally in the environment. Some of those things are inside our body. And so we need to be able to respond to some sort of stimuli as it comes along. As we're going around, we find some food. We're going to need to be able to break that food down and get it into something that is absorbable. As we eat and go about our day, as we break things down and as we build things up, that whole process is what we call metabolism. And so the combination of breaking down and building up catabolic reactions and anabolic reactions, we're going through what we call metabolism. And so this is going to be kind of the normal set pace of functioning of all of the cells within the body itself. We've mentioned the need to get rid of waste. So we have excretion needs. This is going to come primarily from the urinary system as far as the processes, but skin and lungs can help out with that when needed, as well as the digestive tract. For reproduction, when we think of reproduction, most of the time we're going to think of the entire organism. So we need to be able to produce a sperm and an egg. And so the gametes have to be able to be produced, but we also need to reproduce at the cellular level. And so we have to be able to reproduce cells to replace old, dead, worn, dying cells as that need comes along. And when that occurs, we're going to have to increase in size individual cells as well as whole organs and organ systems in order to have growth of the entire organism or the whole body. In order for all of those needs to occur, we need to have some things in order to just plain survive. One of those big things is oxygen. So the majority of all of our processes in the body utilize an oxidative reaction. And in that process, we then need oxygen in order to allow for that to occur. In order to oxidize the things that we have in the body, we're going to need nutrients. So we're going to need things like carbon dioxide or carbohydrates and proteins and lipids. Our whole body is made up almost in terms of a large percentage of water. And the chemical reactions that are occurring for all of that metabolism that we have occurs in a water environment. And so that's going to be our solvent that we have for the body itself. As all of those chemical reactions are occurring, we have a normal body temperature that is going to allow for them to occur at the most optimal rate. If temperature goes too high up, things may happen too quickly. If temperature goes too far down, those reactions may happen too slowly as well. Atmospheric pressure is one of the things that we need to ensure in order for proper gas exchange. And so we need to be able to change the pressure inside our lungs, inside our chest cavity, in order to get oxygen to move in and out of the lungs. If all of that goes well, we have homeostasis. And so if everything goes the way that it's supposed to, we're going to have homeostatic balance, where everything that is essentially being broken down equals everything that's being built back up. And so we're maintaining our internal environment regardless of what happens outside. And so as things cool down, as things warm up, we're able to maintain our body temperature, things like that, no matter what's kind of going on. As well as we have different environmental conditions as far as, say, oxygen levels in the air. We go to some place higher in elevation, we're going to have less oxygen. We're going to have to be able to adapt to that. And so those processes are going to have to occur as well. In order to control these homeostatic processes and keep everything in homeostasis, we need to be able to control things via a feedback loop. And so we have positive and negative feedback processes that we normally use. In order to monitor those, we had said that one of the things that the body has to be able to do is respond to stimuli. So we have receptors in order to do that. And so we're going to detect some sort of change in the environment. That's going to send information over to the control center, and that control center is either going to be the spinal cord or the brain. And then that control center is going to send information out to an effector. And so that effector is going to be something like a muscle or a gland, where we're going to make those alterations in order to maintain homeostasis. And so within homeostasis, we have this balance that occurs as things go either up or down. And so things are constantly changing within the body itself. And so as we move things out of balance, we're going to stimulate some sort of receptor. That receptor sends information over to the control center. The control center processes it, decides who needs to make a change, and sends that information then down to the effector, and we respond. And so whether things are going up or going down, we're going to detect those things so that when things do change, things don't go way, way, way up before we make a change. We're going to allow things to kind of go up a little bit and then come back down a little bit and come up a little bit, so that we maintain things basically along kind of a set point. And so that things are being maintained at certain levels rather than kind of having things go way, way high or way low. And one of the body's main ways to do this is what we call negative feedback. And so in negative feedback, we have a stimulus that is perhaps causing something to go up. And with negative feedback, we're going to bring that thing back down. And then we're going to bring it back up. And then we're going to bring it back down. And then we're going to bring it back up and bring it back down. All the while maintaining that relative kind of, because that one doesn't really show up very well, that balance here somewhere in the middle. Things aren't allowed to go too high, things aren't allowed to go too low. And that way we have this kind of normal changes. So if you had just eaten a meal, that meal caused your blood sugar levels to start to rise. And so we get rising blood sugar levels to occur. That stimulates the pancreas to start to release insulin. That insulin goes out to different places in the body. Essentially, all cells in the body itself are going to respond to insulin. And that's going to tell those cells, take up the sugar, bring it out of the bloodstream, get it back into a cell. As you then essentially fast in between a meal, your blood sugar levels are going to start to fall. And as those blood sugar levels start to fall, we're going to go, in this particular case, back to the pancreas once again. And the pancreas is going to release another hormone called glucagon. And so now glucagon is going to start to be released. That's going to go over to the liver and tell the liver to bring that glucose level back up. And so that the glucose level itself falls somewhere around, change color here, somewhere around 90 milligrams per 100 milliliters. And so it's going up and down and up and down. After a meal, we may get up to 150, 140. While we're fasting that meal, so the median is somewhere in here, and we have our post-meal, we're maybe down somewhere around 80. And so that level is bouncing back and forth and back and forth depending upon which side of a meal we're actually on. It never allows it to go up too far or down too far. With positive feedback, we're going to have kind of a different scenario in a sense. And so with positive feedback, if something is going up, we're going to make it go up even further. And so with positive feedback, we exacerbate or exaggerate the original stimulus. And so we don't use positive feedback very much. And so positive feedback is only used for a few processes within the body, one of which is bleeding. And so the need to be able to form a blood clot. And so with that, we have the controls here for our bleeding itself. We have platelets. Those platelets send off little chemicals. Those little chemicals are going to then travel through the bloodstream, and they're going to cause more platelets to become excited and being brought into the area. And that causes more of the platelets, and they start to form a plug. As they start to form that plug, they also are initiating a further cascade that's going to create a kind of a gelatinous structure inside there. And this positive feedback keeps on going until something drastic happens. And in the case of blood clotting, that drastic thing that's going to happen is we either have a clot or the person has basically bled out. And so those processes are going to continue around and around and around. Childbirth would be another process, and so labor is a similar positive feedback loop. And so basically, pressure on the cervix causes the release of more oxytocin. More oxytocin causes more contractions, which leads to more pressure on the cervix, which leads to more oxytocin, and basically that positive loop goes around and around and around until baby's born. And then the process can stop. So something big has to happen in order to get us out of a positive feedback loop. If we get stuck in a positive feedback loop, and so sometimes what happens is negative feedback. So in the case of like diabetes, the blood glucose levels are going up and up and up and up and up. And we may start to get into a situation where we're attempting to bring things back down, but we don't quite get there. And so we end up going into a positive feedback loop. We get into this emergent situation to try and bring things down, but that actually ends up kind of stalling out, and we may end up having disease. So we don't want to have that imbalance where the normal processes aren't able to keep up. We need to have negative feedback kind of doing its job at all times. To switch back to anatomy for a little bit, we have, when it comes to anatomy and comes to kind of terms in anatomy, one of the things that we have to kind of start out with is realizing that we have normal anatomical position. And so what normal anatomical position does is it allows us to essentially talk about things. No matter who we talk to, they automatically know exactly what we're talking about and where we're talking about, because they're going to imagine the body in anatomical position. And so just like the figure here, we have the person standing, so they're upright, they're facing forward with their head, their eyes are looking forward, their feet are flat on the ground. And one of the important things in terms of the limbs is that the palms are facing forward. And so the palms are pointing towards the front of the body. And this is our standard position. No matter what structure we talk about, we're always going to be talking about it in relationship to this particular position. So that when we start to talk about things in relationship to one another, we can talk about things whether they are superior or inferior to one another. And so superior is at the top of the head, inferior is at the bottom of the feet. And so things can be superior and inferior to one another. Your mouth is inferior to your nose, but your nose is superior to your mouth. We have anterior versus posterior. And so anterior and posterior, this is just front and back. Anterior sometimes goes by ventral, and posterior sometimes goes by dorsal. And so depending upon who you read, you may see those terms used as well for those. When we start to look at the torso, we can look at things for being medial and lateral. And so medial is basically the midline of the body, so your nose is more medial than your eyes. But your ears are lateral to your eyes. They're further away from that midline. When we talk about the extremities, we talk about proximal and distal. And so with proximal and distal, we're talking about things in terms of them being either closer to or further away from the origin of the body. And so with those structures there, we have things that are closer to the body. We have things like our elbow is proximal to the wrist, but our wrist is distal to the elbow. When we talk about organs, we can talk about superficial and deep. And so when we talk about things like even muscles, we have some muscles that lie on top of one another. So the one that's closest to the skin would be the superficial muscle, and the one that's kind of deeper into the body would be the deep muscle. And the next couple of slides just kind of reiterate that. And so we have the different terms there with each one of those. So you can find similar pictures to those in your textbook. The next two slides are regional terms. This slide and the next slide, you don't have to memorize the entire slide. I won't ask you to actually fill in a chart or anything like that. But you should become familiar with it because a lot of the terms that are used here are terms that we're going to use when we start to name things like bones and muscles and nerves. All of those will start to kind of come back to that as far as the body is concerned on those. So things like the femoral region there, we have things that are the femoral artery, we have the femur in terms of bone, we have the femoral vein, we have the femoral nerve. All of that relates back to that one little part of the body itself. We can also divide the body up based upon kind of cutting it or making slices through the body. And so this is primarily used for either making sections of a particular area or in terms of imaging. And so we have things like our sagittal view within the body. And so that sagittal plane is going to take and divide the body up into as far as the sagittal is concerned, into right and left halves. And so the sagittal here is dividing the body into a right and left half. The sagittal plane has a special one called the mid-sagittal plane in that it's right in the very center of the body. So this divides the body up into right and left halves equally. If we were to look at the surface anatomy, basically we have a mirror image between the two sides. From there we have things like our frontal plane. The frontal plane is also referred to as the coronal plane at times. And so we'll see structures that are named based upon that coronal plane structure as well. Top and bottom, we have transverse, so superior and inferior planes are involved there. What we're going to learn and talk about is what we call normal anatomy. And so for normal anatomy, basically the vast majority of people all have the structures in exactly the same spot within their body themselves. So 90% of the anatomical structures from one person to the next are all in exactly the same spot. We can look at them, we can find them. If you look at for something in a textbook somewhere or a anatomy book of some sort, you're going to find that if you go to look for it on a person, it's going to be in that exact same spot. Some variability comes from things like nerves and blood vessels because they may need to find their way around in different times that are there. We'll look at the case of some missing muscles at times. Same thing goes for bones. But for big variations within the body, oftentimes they're not compatible with life. And so when those changes are very, very big, it's going to lead to big problems that the body can't really overcome. When we start to look at the internal organs, we'll start to see that we have body cavities. And so the two big body cavities that we have are the dorsal body cavity and the ventral cavity. And so the dorsal body cavity houses the brain and spinal cord. And so the dorsal body cavity can be divided up into a cranial cavity and a vertebral cavity for those. And then on the anterior side, we have the ventral body cavity. Everything in red there is all ventral body cavity on there. And that's divided up into a thoracic cavity, an abdominal cavity, and a pelvic cavity. The thoracic and abdominal cavity have a physical barrier. They have the diaphragm in between the two. But between the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, this dividing line isn't a physical structure. So this dividing line is just an imaginary line that's basically drawn from the top of the sacrum down to the pubic bone. So there's nothing that actually separates the abdomen and the pelvis in terms of the cavities. And so that's where oftentimes they're referred to as the abdominal pelvic cavity. And so they kind of get lumped in together with one another. The thoracic cavity is further divided up as well. And so the thoracic cavity has two pleural cavities, one for each lung. And then in the middle there, we have what's called the mediastinum. And then we have the pericardial cavity. And so the pleural cavities contain the lungs. The mediastinum contains the big vessels. And so this is containing things like the aorta, the superior vena cava, the trachea, and the esophagus. And then the pericardial cavity just holds the heart. And so we find the heart inside that pericardial cavity there. We talked about the abdominal pelvic cavities themselves. And so the abdominal cavity contains the majority of all of the digestive organs, as well as part of the urinary system. And then the pelvic cavity contains part of the urinary system as well, in that it has the bladder. And then it has the internal reproductive organs. And then the very last part of the digestive tract. The ventral body cavities have essentially linings to them. And so we have two linings, one on the body wall, which we call parietal, and one on the actual organs, which we call visceral. Depending upon where we are, whether we're in the thorax, whether we're in the abdomen, whether we're in the pelvis, we're going to change this serosa part to match what we have in those particular areas of the body. And so with these membranes, what we end up with is essentially that pleural lining. We have the visceral lining, and then there's a little space in between. And that space that's in between has a tiny bit of fluid there. And that allows for that organ to move around. So if it's the heart here, we're going to change the serosa part of the name to match the organ that we're talking about. So we have a parietal pericardium, and then we have a visceral pericardium. And so the two layers, the parietal being the outer layer, the visceral layer being the one that's actually on the organ itself. And then there's a small little space in between, and that has a little bit of fluid, provides for lubrication so that we don't have organ rubbing against organ. In addition to the big body cavities that we have some smaller body cavities throughout the body as well. And so we have things like for the digestive tract, we have the oral cavity, and then that continues down through the digestive tract itself. We have the nasal cavity, and so this is the space where the nose is. Pictures here. So we have the nasal cavity that's there. We have the oral cavity for the mouth going inside there. And then in many of our joints, and we'll get to this when we start to talk about the bones in the joints themselves, we have what we call a synovial cavity. And so this synovial cavity is found in all of our synovial joints. And so essentially the majority of the joints that we have in the body are all synovial. They provide for lots of movement, and they need lubrication. That lubrication comes from fluid that sits in between the two bones. When it comes to the abdomen and pelvis, we divide the abdomen and pelvis up into abdominal pelvic regions, or we can do it into quadrants. Regions allow us to divide it up into smaller areas, and so we end up with 9 different regions, named based upon the region of the body that were there in each one. So starting out in the umbilical region, right in the center, and then we're going to move up and below the stomach. So we have our epigastric and hypogastric regions. We're just below the diaphragm. So we have our left and our right hypochondriacs. And then below that, we have our lumbars, right and the left. And then we have the iliac or inguinal regions. What you'll notice here as well is that it's this particular person's left and this particular person's right. It's not your left and right. It is always in relationship to the individual that we're talking about. So it's always there, right and left. And so when we look at it from the regions, we end up with a relatively small amount of organs that are available in each one of those regions compared to of the quadrants. With the quadrants, we have a lot of areas there. And so we have a much larger space available. So the left upper quadrant here contains the majority of the stomach. We've got the spleen, we've got large intestines, small intestines, liver, lots of things can be going wrong there. Versus with the regions, this would have been divided up into multiple other sections on there. So we would have divided that up quite a bit more for those. But once again, it is the left and the right of this particular person. And next time we'll start to go through and look at the cells.